All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, Kim.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is really exciting, Savan. I'm excited to see what you're doing with this. It's amazing to
Thank
be here.
thank you.
Yeah,
There's there's so much that we could talk about.
hmm
So I'm excited kind of where we're gonna go.
yeah, yeah. I am too. I was looking over those notes that you had given me just that pre-show workup and looking through all those amazing questions, and I'm curious to see kind of what we create together today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The I saw recently
Mhm.
that you did a trauma training
Yeah.
um, for the Young Life group.
hmm
Um, and so uh, I, I'm curious about your involvement with Young Life.
Yeah.
Usually I ask folks about their background to start with, but
Mhm.
would it be okay to start with like Young Life Ministry, talking
Would
about
love
that?
to. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. Yeah. So what you're referring to is I, along with my co-leader, Aaron Kelsey, who is probably one of the most brilliant people that I know, brilliant clinicians that I know, we were invited back to come and do a trauma-informed care training with the Mount Hood Young Life region of our area. And what's interesting about that is that Aaron and I both were on staff with Young Life. So I spent 8 years with the Mount Hood region with their Portland East YoungLives group, which was their ministry to teen moms. The first 4 years, I was a volunteer. And then I had an opportunity to step on as basically kind of like area director of that particular ministry. So I got to work
Hmm.
with teen moms ages 12 all the way up to about 20-ish years old. And
Hmm.
that was something that I was really, really passionate about working with. And I did that as I was onboarding into grad school. So we were able to be invited back to go teach the staff that is still on staff there just about how to work with kids who have encountered trauma before. And we're actually doing a 3-part series where we kind of started with this trauma informed care. We got them kind of camp ready. Then we'll be able to move into what does that look like between staff members? How do they care for one another as they're going through traumatic experiences and
Hmm.
or through their own stories? And then we'll also be working on kind of spiritual abuse, which I think is something that really comes up with a lot in kind of the evangelical culture, if I could be so bold as to say that, um,
Hmm.
being someone
Hmm.
with a background in evangelicalism. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So the you were a volunteer
Mhm.
and then on staff.
Yeah.
Is that your when you were a volunteer, was that one of the things that motivated you to become a counselor?
You know, interestingly enough, no. I think that there's definitely a blending of those two worlds, but I would say the reason I became a counselor has to do with my movement through the healing process. So
Mm.
if it's okay, I'll kind of drop into that a little bit and maybe catch us up to where I actually got on with Young Life too.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Yeah. So
absolutely.
the reason I became a therapist, the reason I came on staff with Young Life has to do with my own story. And we'll kind of touch base. This is a big story. So I'm thinking, how do we drop into this? Because my story is also my work. Um,
Mm.
so I come from a pretty pervasive background of domestic violence, both from my childhood and also from my marriage. My former marriage, I'm no longer married. I, like Jesus, am single. So I like to throw that out there. When I first started, gosh, this is such a long story, Savan, but I started seeing a trauma therapist. And through the course of my work with her, was encouraged to get involved with Abuse Recovery Ministry, which is a local organization that teaches both victims about the cycle of abuse and also works with perpetrators to teach them about the cycle of abuse and how to live healthy, how to do the recovery portion. In the midst of that, I was invited to come and speak on a panel. So survivors were speaking to perpetrators of
Mm.
abuse, and I was invited to come to speak on that. And surprise of all surprises, I discovered I had this gift to speak publicly. And I only knew that through the eyes of the audience that I was speaking to, the feedback that I was getting.
Yeah.
Through that, was invited to come back and teach first responders, other clinicians, what it looked like to have a pervasive story of abuse, what it sounded like. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was it like the first time you did that? Like, especially speaking to perpetrators.
Yeah, it was rough, but at the same time, it was so empowering. I was still getting
Mm.
used to the language of domestic violence or domestic abuse. I didn't really know that much about it. All I knew was that the first time I arrived in a Her Journey class, which is the victim side of the abuse recovery ministry, the victim education side. Um, the first thing I noticed about that group, and it hit me so intently, was that we all had one thing in common, and that was that we had a perpetrator. And I thought, wow, this is new language. This is a new feeling for me. So I think that kind of lit this fire. Was I started to kind of wake up from this deep sleep that I had been in, this trauma sleep that I had been in. So the first time I actually went to speak, this is also kind of a funny story. I was pulled over for the first time in my life, and the
Hmm.
police officer said, he goes, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'm headed to the local courthouse. I'm going to go speak on domestic violence." And
Amazing.
he said, "You know what? I'm going to let you go on this one. You head to the courthouse. Here's how you get there." And so I think that there were some distractions walking in. But that first time, I was just so supported by the community that was there, and had such
Mm.
an amazing um, reaction from the audience. And these were men who had been in the hands of harm. They were harming other people. And I thought, this is so empowering. And so while it was challenging and difficult, it was just so empowering to me too. And I remember going, I want to do this more. I don't know anything about what's happening right now, but whatever this is, I need more of it. Mhm.
Wow. We're that's amazing. We're going out of order,
Yeah. A little
and so it's like that movie Memento going backwards.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
how how did you start to wake up out of the sleep?
Yeah. That has a lot to do with my story with my own therapist. I've worked with the same therapist for the last, I think we're going on 12 years now.
Mm.
And her just sitting with me and inviting me into this space of exploration and giving me freedom, right, to re identify myself. I was able to discover that I had emotions and I had feelings and I had aspirations that had just died in my early 20s and had stayed pretty dead for most of my 20s.
Mm.
And as I went forward and accomplished each of these small, tiny movements, I discovered I think that God actually has a much bigger, different plan for me. And so that does actually lead into how I came on staff with YoungLife. Um, I started undergrad, and I very tenderly walked into undergrad. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to go to school, let alone be successful. And that first term, I realized, oh, I'm actually kind of good at going to school. And wow, my voice seems to be important in this place. And when I started school, I only wanted to get some kind of authority, I guess, to be able to continue speaking. And it was almost as if, Saban, each class that I took was building on that story of identity. It was waking me up just a little bit more. As I
Mm.
studied the social sciences, as I studied human development, these little whispers of, your life was not meant to be how it was. Your life is
Mm.
worth so much more. Dream, dream, dream. And as a
Wow.
trauma survivor, a dream is not something that is available. Hope is not readily available. It's
Mm.
as if you are walking through, like I said, just really asleep. It's kind of like, like when you're out camping and it's so dark and there's no city lights to light up anything, but you're carrying a flashlight.
Mm.
and that flashlight cast a beam, and the beam, wherever that beam lights up, that's where you can see, but everything else remains dark. And I feel like that's kind of the cloud that I was walking in. And I think so many of the people that I currently work with, that I come into contact with, that's what it feels like. It feels like everything is in the dark. And so my job as a therapist, and I think my therapist's job with me, was just to start casting that beam. And as I completed school, it got wider and wider.
Mm.
So even in
Wow.
my undergrad, I didn't think I was going to be a therapist. I just kept thinking, let's see if I can do one class. Let's see if I can do
Mm.
2 classes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But each class just
Mhm.
um, um you just grew more,
Mhm.
more and more, or it got clearer
It got clearer.
more
Yeah.
and more.
Clear.
Yeah.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
as I'm going through classes, my therapist is like, you're really good at this. You're really smart. She's feeding me these beautiful things about my identity that I was like,
Mm.
I, I don't know what you're talking about, but I think I'm going to tenderly step a little bit closer to what you're saying.
Mm.
Mhm.
Mm. The- Uh, being a victim of domestic violence and um, having gone through trauma, you you weren't sure of your abilities. You
Mhm.
question yourself,
Yeah.
um, and it's just amazing that just taking a class um,
Mhm.
in undergrad can be so powerful.
Yeah.
Um, and the so you loved the classes.
Yeah, I did. I did. I loved everything about going back to school, even in my fear of, am I capable of doing this? I loved every bit of it.
Mm.
And it was hard, right? I was
You
arguing.
had to go back to school.
I did.
Not straight out of high school.
No. So when I was in high school, I actually had, this is before they did this, but I had actually gone to community college as a senior and had taken a couple classes on my own. So I was doing both. And then I actually got married at 18 and started having babies at 19. And so by the time I discovered that I was in this cycle of domestic violence, I was in full parenting mode. That's what I did. I took care of babies, and there was really nothing else. I was just wife and mom. So when I went back to school as an adult, I think I started the week before my 29th birthday. I started my undergraduate degree in human development. So,
Wow. So
yeah,
you had been out of school for over 10 years.
yeah, yeah, I had been.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So with each class that I accomplished, my dream got just a little bit wider. So I remember about halfway through my undergrad, um, I started feeling like, I don't know what's next, but I know I'm going to at least get a master's. That was my goal. I'm going to at least get a master's. And I would say that plan didn't solidify until maybe the last couple months of my degree, my undergrad degree, where I thought, I actually think I want to become a counselor. And I was really fearful of the language. And of course, as an abuse survivor, I had to get a lot of external validation. I had asked that question a lot, of my family, my extended family, of my church family, of my therapist. Do you think I could maybe kind of sort of do this thing? And needed other people to say, we absolutely see something in you. Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to give you a little space to talk about something I just noticed. I
Okay.
just noticed I said victim,
Oh,
and and I also noticed that you said survivor.
mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for noticing that. So, the way that I think about it is that we use the term survivor as a way to add hope to people who have been victimized by domestic abuse.
Mm.
Um, and the reason it is victim has this idea that you are continuing to be manipulated or put under the authority or force of someone else unwillingly. That has the connotation around victim.
Right.
Survivor says you are not just the person who has been harmed, but look at what you've gone through and look at where you can go. And I am on your side. You are so strong. And so
Mm.
while I will say, yes, I can identify with both, and I've done a lot of work around that language, when I work with people who've been through that experience, I try to use the word survivor.
Mm.
Unless, of course, I am teaching them that they actually did survive domestic abuse, then I will tenderly use some of that victim language. But that really has a connotation of not having the control that they need over their own life. So I use the word survivor.
Yes. Thank you. I
Yeah.
need to do that. So
Mhm.
yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um,
So I kind of got off course a little bit, but Young
oh,
Life entered the scene in my undergrad
yes.
program.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you started volunteering and helping other young moms.
Yes.
Um, and I'm guessing some of them like seemed like familiar
Yeah.
well, how you grew up and what you went through
Hmm.
as a
Yeah.
young mom.
Yeah, absolutely. When we actually had somebody come and speak to our young adult or our adult group at church, and she was looking for people to come and join her in this mission. And everything within me was like, yes, this makes so much sense. My mom was a teen mom. And although I was married, I was also a teen parent. And there was just something that was so drawing. And so, again, I didn't have the language, but felt like so reparative, right? As adults, so many times we don't even realize that we're doing this, but we try to be the person that we needed when we were younger.
Mm,
And so there was something about being invited to Young Life. And as that was presented to me, I thought, I don't know, but I got to do this. I got to be part of whatever this is. And that was actually my first introduction to Young Life, even though it was really popular in the school that I went to in my area. That was my first real introduction, was this woman coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to go work with teens. Who wants to join me? So I kind of jumped in with both feet and started learning about Young Life and about ministry to teen moms. And my heart grew 3 sizes. And I discovered, man, I really like working with teens. So,
yes.
yeah.
The 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 work that you did with them,
Hmm.
uh, what are some of the ways it it shaped you
Yeah.
as a mom, as a woman,
Yeah.
or even as a therapist?
I credit Young Life with helping to give me a sense of self confidence. I didn't fit what I expected Young Life to be. A lot of times with Young Life, we see kind of a younger crowd that is leading it. And I thought, I don't fit here, right?
Mm,
Like,
hmm.
this is so deep, but like I don't look like these people. I'm a mom. Like, how am I doing Young Life at this point? And
Mm,
so, just by even being on the volunteer leader side of being involved with Young Life, I discovered so much about myself. But what I loved most about working with Young Life was that I saw, and again, I didn't have the language for it, but I saw the trauma the girls were going through. And I remember thinking to myself, I've been there. Wait, this story is so familiar to me.
mm,
And I want to show these girls that there's another way. And I started recognizing, right, in the course of this, I'm going through my own trauma therapy. I'm still speaking for abuse recovery ministry. I'm going to school. There's all of these things happening. And I remember thinking, like, all of these girls need is someone on their team, someone who can show them that life can look different. Meanwhile, they're also showing me that I am enough to look towards as well. And so
mm,
it really made a big impact. You're right on how I parented, on who I let into my circle. Young Life is all about relationships. And so I learned to like bring these girls kind of as a mother hen under my wing, right? And
mm.
learn to love them really, really well through really tragic circumstances. Mhm.
Oh.
Yeah.
Uh, do do you do you do groups in your counseling practice?
I do not do groups. So, no, I do not.
Because
Yeah.
the picture of mother hen, I was
Yeah.
wondering if you still get the chance to do that
I
with your
do.
clients. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So, yeah, I don't know if that might be a good point to kind of drop into, what I do as a therapist or um
yeah. Well, yes. Mm, would like you to say a little bit more.
mhm.
Um, uh, you said that you didn't have the language
Yeah.
for it.
Mhm.
Um, the for folks that are working, even even if they're not doing a ministry or Young Life in particular, um, but can you share with any parent or someone who's like youth pastor or someone mentoring uh, teens? what are some of the the words that you'd share um, to help them
Mhm.
with the kids that they're working with?
Yeah, anytime we're working with kids, I think it's really easy to make judgment calls about where they are, what they're going through. And I think with our adult brains, we often look at the teens and we go, why are you acting the way that you're acting? Right? Why
Mm-hmm.
is it that you are refusing what I feel like is such simple wisdom? Why can't you get your stuff together and follow this rhythm that I want you to follow? And so I have had to learn in my practice. I see teens quite a bit. I attract a younger crowd because of my work with Young Life. Um, and I have had to learn that I need to trust their process, right? I will say that over and over again. I trust your process and I trust our process together. And so there's a couple of words that I think are really important when we're working with teens. And it goes both ways to teach them this, but to model this as well and to be thinking about this. The first word is curiosity. Look at them, sit with them, be with them in curiosity. Wonder what's driving this right now. I wonder what's happening for this person. And that's a distinguish between why are you doing that to what happened to you, that this is how you're presenting yourself. The other thing is permission, giving ourselves permission and giving the kids permission to be how they need to be without judgment. And that kind of leads us back to that curiosity piece too. So those are two main things that I often do when I'm working with teens and when I'm training about working with teens is take a deep breath, adults. Remember what it was like. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
stuff happening. Trust the process, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that I talk about quite frequently. As far as learning the language around traumatic experiences, that comes with time. Anytime we're learning something new, we talk about this idea of like wanting to transition ourselves or learn language. And it's like, yes, that's important. But what's more important is this transformation, and transformation has to do with how we posture ourselves towards knowledge, towards human beings, towards self-acceptance, and we actually do that through relationship. And so more than anything, again, kind of coming back to that, like show curiosity, give permission to be human, and just build relationship.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so powerful. It's neat that I I've heard about Young Life Ministry, but I didn't
Yeah.
realize uh, how important relationships
Hmm.
are in that. And absolutely, with with growing and finding your identity and learning, but also uh, healing and recovering from trauma.
Yeah.
I I'm I'm still learning. Just feel uh, like such a beginner
Mm,
in the area of trauma, but
mm,
seeing like more and more realizing how much it affects individual personal growth, but how it affects relationships.
mm.
Um,
This idea of like community intimacy, right? Community growth. It's about our individual relationships. Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that I always talk about when I'm talking about my own story is the idea of the ripple effect and how that ripple effect, we have the way I describe it is we have relationships that fit in concentric circles. You've got your most intimate relationships closer in, and then you've got maybe a little bit further out close relationships that aren't quite as intimate, and then you've got friends and acquaintances and social media people, and all of those are important in your story. But what happens with the ripple effect is whatever you change, that has a ripple effect on all those outside layers of friendships and relationships too. And so I think that that's a really important concept when we're thinking about trauma, both for positive and negative, right? Whatever happens is going to affect the community as it should. And if it's not, then we have a bigger problem.
yeah. Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah. With before we dive into your work with your
Yeah.
clients,
Hmm.
uh, would you like to share any part of your story with your marriage?
Yeah. I think that that is a really important part of my story. And it's actually something that I'm currently writing through right now.
Mm,
I'm doing some work on writing a series of books right now, slowly but surely, right? There's not always time to get all that done.
mhm,
But yeah, my experience with my marriage, I am about 4 years post divorce now. And it was what I call a holy divorce. It was a sacred moment for me personally and for my kids too. The kind of abuse that I suffered in my marriage, what hits all the markers: financial, spiritual, physical, and a lot of emotional abuse. But they're things that I didn't really notice and I didn't know to notice. And I don't think that he did either. I feel really compassionate towards that part of our story together. But also, I view this as the thing that helped. Not that I would ever want this, right? I've begged and pleaded God, like, can't I have learned these lessons a different way than having to go through the trauma stories that I did? But I
mm,
also recognize that because I lived through trauma, I'm able to do my work really well now. And so I was married for, gosh, 17, I guess almost 16 years. So I really stuck it out for a really long time. Um, and I actually divorced mid grad school studies. So that's an interesting part. I kind of got to the point where I'm working with domestic violence and I'm leading these young life girls who are coming from domestic violence. With Young Life, we often say like 1 and 2 kids have come into our program with trauma. And in Young Lives, the teen mom program, we would say 100% of the girls come in with trauma. And
mm,
it just reached a crescendo for me where I thought, I can't keep going out into the world and doing this healing trauma work and coming back into that in my home experience. I have to have a better balance. And so that was part of why I chose to remove myself from the relationship.
okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how hard you want to hit this ball that I'm going to throw at you right now.
Okay.
But I'm curious about your thoughts on how Christian community or church community
Mhm.
supports or helps women going through uh, domestic violence.
Yeah, I think some church communities are doing a great job with it, but I think that they're failing in a lot of ways. I was with the same church for about 30 years, from the age of 13 until just recently, and I loved my church family as far as the people individually. I felt a ton of support. Also, in our story with the church, they didn't have the language of domestic violence. And so I felt like our story was the first story that we were making them reckon with what was happening. And so there
Mm,
were a lot of mistakes that were made in our story, both because the church community didn't know what to do with it, they didn't know what to call it. And as an abuse survivor, I was still dealing with how pervasive is this, right? People who've gone through traumatic experiences, they're always trying to compare. Wait, is this as bad as this
mm,
other thing that I've seen happening? So I think that was always in my mind and how I presented our abuse story in the church environment. And so I would say one on one, I loved the people that were at our church. They were helpful, kind, supportive. But as far as giving us resources or helping the abuse to stop, I felt very unprotected in our
mm,
church environment. And I think I see that quite a bit. It's such a pervasive problem. And honestly, we see a lot of abusers are in the church cycle because they can hide behind the language of the Bible.
mm,
And that sounds like my wife needs to be respectful. She needs to be, let me lead. She
mm.
needs to be subservient to me or submissive to me. And there are things about that are true, biblically that are true, potentially, but it's misused in domestic violence over and over and over again.
Yeah,
Mm.
and I think a lot of uh, churches
Mhm.
um, they don't have the framework or the 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 experience
Mhm.
like what you're describing
Mhm.
to to help couples work through it because just the whole idea of like uh does this make meet the grounds
Yeah.
for divorce
Yes.
um and so
There's a lot of
There's
victim
pressure.
blaming. Yes,
Yes, there.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and
And I don't think
lots
it's
of
intentional.
unhelpful. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't think it's intentional. At least it wasn't in my story. I really don't
Mm,
think that my community was being intentional in their victim blaming. I just think they didn't know any better. I
mm,
don't think they knew any other way to talk about what was happening. I was in a very conservative church. Um, and I think that the language that they used was confusing to me as someone who was going through the abuse cycle, because I was listening to this language of be meek, be mild, turn the other cheek, pray. What are you doing wrong? How are you sinning? And while all those things might be true, they're not effective nor are they appropriate in abuse circumstances. And so we got muddled in that over and over and over again. And that's where it became very dangerous for
mm,
me and for my kids, and quite honestly, for him too. It
mm.
didn't do him any service to not be held accountable.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You're so you're writing on your experience,
I am.
um, and um, in the meantime,
Yeah.
are there any resources or books that you've found helpful, like that you'd recommend to
Yeah.
uh, couples or individuals going through what you've been
Yeah. I think that's a complicated answer in that whenever we see domestic violence, we don't treat the couple, we treat the individual. And so I would say that the number one resource in our area is going to be Abuse Recovery Ministries. That is absolutely where I send every person that I work with and anyone who asks me questions on this. And here's why. Our system, our legal system is not set up to protect people, to protect women. And this happens to men too, but I come from it from the perspective of the woman's side because that's what I know best. Our legal system is not set up to protect women and children in cases of domestic abuse that don't involve pervasive physical violence, if that makes sense. So there's multiple levels of domestic abuse, domestic violence. But in the most cases, unless you can prove imminent danger and unless you can show a wound, our legal system doesn't know how to work with it. And
through?
so resourcing is really hard, especially if you are not pervasively poor. So the other side of that is that there are a lot of places to go and seek help. But if you are at all wealthy from any level of wealth, those kinds of places are not necessarily set up to serve you well.
Mm,
The places that, like the shelters, you have to give up everything. You have to give up your phone. You can't leave the premise, which is good for some circumstances, but there's really not a lot for um, mainstream population around domestic violence. And so, abuse
mm,
recovery ministries, it's all about knowledge. And knowledge is hard and tender, Savon, right? Like, I
mm,
would never say to a domestic abuse survivor or victim, here, go read this book. What I need them to do is get involved with a healthy counselor and community where they
mm.
can safely learn about what's happening to them.
Get
Because as
get
we know,
safe and
yeah,
get connected with the
yep.
relationships they need. Mm,
Because as we know, the most dangerous part for women is when they decide to leave or call abuse. That becomes the most dangerous part in the cycle of domestic violence, even if they're with a partner who hasn't been overtly physically harmful. The
mm.
moment they say enough
To
is
that
enough and
point.
they try to leave,
Mm,
it becomes worse and their partners will inevitably become violent.
mm.
Mhm.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Thank
that's
you.
part of why I'm writing this book. Because
Mm,
I want to give resources to it, and I want that the resource to be for the women who have been in this circumstance before, also the helpers who might recognize something in my story in the lives of the people that they know.
mm.
Mhm.
Great. Great. Yeah. The uh, in the meantime, you do speaking.
I do.
Continue to do speaking and trainings about it.
Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit, uh,
Sure.
just briefly.
Yeah.
Um, uh, which, which do you enjoy more, writing or speaking?
Oh gosh. I never have enough time to write ever. As a sole parent to three kids, working full time, I always feel like there's something else important coming up. But I equally like both. I think that when I speak, it gives me the opportunity to process through my story or the information that I'm presenting. And when I write, it does the same thing. But I think it takes me a little bit more to get in the process of writing. Like I
Mm.
have a little bit of ADHD. I'm pretty high functioning, but I have a little bit of that. So in order to get myself to calm down to actually put words on paper, that can take a little bit to get into that cycle. But I would say for me at least, they go hand in hand. I'm not sure I could have one without the other.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. The uh w- while bef in the meantime, while we're waiting for your book,
Yeah.
folks can read your blog.
Yes, my blog.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
definitely gonna link uh,
yeah.
to that.
Redemptive grace. Yep.
Yeah. Thanks.
Mhm.
Um. So um, quite quite a journey to get through
Yeah,
undergrad
yeah,
and grad school, and uh, go through a divorce
yeah.
halfway through or in the middle
Mhm,
of your program.
mhm.
Um, Tell us a little bit about what it's been like as you started your practice and like and who you mentioned you work with teens. Who are the other folks that you work with in your counseling practice?
Well, interestingly enough, I love the story of my practice. I mentioned working with a counselor that I've been with for right around 11, 12 years now. And I actually started my private practice when I was in the last year of my graduate studies at Western. And I had the privilege of doing that because of the way that my story had been set up with my own counselor.
Mm,
And so I actually started training with a fellow clinician here who actually trained my counselor however long ago, 15 years ago. She had walked through her story of trauma with the person who trained me on how to work with trauma. And
mm.
so I love that story because I call him my grandpa therapist, but I don't think he really likes that. So, one thing I love about this story of my practice, Savon, is that, and my counselor actually gave me this view. She said, it's as if you are marching forward, right? And you have linked arms with me and with Byron and with Mary Jane, the other kind of what I would call master therapists who have said yes to being my supervisor in consultations groups. And
Mm,
so in my private practice, I don't really work with other clinicians because it's just me. Granted, I have clinicians down the hallway, but it's just me in my private practice. And so I would say, there's a handful of master clinicians that I've been able to learn from and glean wisdom from. But my day to day, it's just me, my clients, working through this process together. So I'm
mm.
forgetting what your original question is. I just started talking.
Well, the so the folks that come to see you, besides trauma, do you have other specialties,
Oh, yeah.
or things that you help folks with?
Yeah. So I love this question so much because it's a really long answer, and I'm going to do my best to keep it short. I I bill myself as a trauma recovery therapist. And that just means that I work with people who have suffered from trauma. My sweet spot is kind of the late teens or younger adults, but I have people in my practice from the ages of like 16 on up into mid 50s. And there's one common thing about every person I work with. They all have childhood emotional neglect, and they all come to me saying, I don't have any childhood emotional neglect. Usually, the people that come
Mhm.
into my practice or that are attracted to my way of thinking or my way of presenting myself, they're curious about the idea of combining relational neuroscience with attachment science. Um, so I attract a lot of people who have complex post traumatic stress. And that actually presents itself in a lot of different ways. So I have a couple of clients that I work with that are very what we call high acuity, which means their diagnoses are a little bit higher, they're a little bit less functioning. Like schizoaffective disorder, dissociative identity disorder,
Mhm.
OCD. Those are
Their
some of the
their
diagnoses.
their emotional struggles, their conditions really impair their daily activities. their
Absolutely. Yeah.
ability to work or have healthy relationships.
Yeah, and I would say they are just functioning enough that that's not necessarily known to them. They come
Oh,
into my practice and they're saying something's not working, right? Like my
mm,
relationships don't, like there's so much conflict and I've got all these things that I'm doing like drinking, or I'm depressed all the time, I'm sleeping a lot. And then through the course of our work together, we discover the trauma, we discover the core. And so, even in these diagnoses like DID, dissociative identity disorder, we used to call that multiple personality. Now we know better about it and we know it's heavy layers of dissociation. Even that, we track back to trauma, right? When I first
mm,
started practicing with DID, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm over my head. I don't know how to do this. And one of my supervisors said, stop. This is just a traumatic response. It's just higher up on the continuum of how it's presenting. And
mm,
so, all that to say, I work with trauma. That's what I work with. And in my practice, people who come and see me generally stay for many years in their work with me, because the trauma recovery process takes a lot of time, both to get to the point where we can introduce that this is the story, and then to systematically take it apart takes a lot of time. So,
mm,
yeah.
mm,
So I
yeah,
really work with people on like a long time frame.
mm,
Hmm.
yeah. The uh, the past year,
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
pandemic, the shutdown.
Yeah.
If someone's had a trauma background,
Hmm.
uh, how has this last year affected them in particular?
Yeah, so this kind of folds us back to Young Life. So this time last year, I had been on staff for almost 4 years with Young Life, and I was recognizing that my work with trauma was. I noticed with the girls that I was working with, they needed me to be a trauma therapist, and I couldn't be a therapist while I was working on staff with Young Life. So
Mm,
I decided after the pandemic that I think my skill set is better used as a therapist than it is as a Young Life leader. So when the pandemic hit last year, I went from seeing, gosh, probably roughly 20 to 30 sessions a month to this last month, I had 90 sessions. And so, what's happened then with the pandemic is that we're seeing a lot of activation, right? So, being shut down, having a lack of security around getting the basics activates the system into a trauma response. And so that's what we're seeing in people over and over again. So people are coming into my practice and they're like, I don't know what's happening. I feel out of control. My depression's worse. My anxiety is increasing. I'm having panic attacks. I'm yelling at my kids all the time. These are
mm,
the things that they're presenting with. And when we look at it, we're finding that, yes, what's happening to you right now in this pandemic relates back to what happened to you at this time in your childhood, where you felt out of control or you couldn't choose for yourself what your life looked like. So it's absolutely what I call activating rather than trauma triggering. It's
mm,
the way I talk about it a little bit more. So it activates the central nervous system. And when that happens, our heart rate increases, our executive functioning, where we think and make decisions, goes offline, and we become very reactionary. And so all of the pandemic, right? We're talking about stay home, loss of jobs, loss of income, loss of freedom to move about. Those things are absolutely impacting and bringing up a familiar feeling. And I think that this is the key of what you're asking
mm,
in this activation around the pandemic. We might not be afraid of where our meal's going to come from necessarily, but our bodies remember what it felt like when we didn't have the thing that we needed, when we didn't have the security, when we didn't have the continuity. So it's not even a conscious thought that these two things are connected. It's a, my body's responding. And right, trauma lives in the tissues of our body.
mm,
Our body responds, it remembers, it encodes trauma. Even if we don't cognitively know or remember those stories, our body remembers. And so that's where a lot of the activation has come from around our pandemic.
yeah.
Mhm.
The and this is happening for parents. So
Yeah.
um
And kids.
and kids.
Yes.
I'm you mentioned childhood emotional neglect.
Yes. Hmm.
Um do you have any advice or recommendations for parents who are struggling
Yeah.
with the activation
Hmm.
and not wanting to neglect their kids?
Yeah.
You know,
Y-
struggling or feeling overwhelmed with parenting.
Right. Working full time from home while your kids are home or while your babies are around, and how to manage all of the chaos and all of the stress, right?
Mm,
The best advice, and I don't give advice very much, so I tend to think about it in terms of what soothes your soul. That's how I talk about it a lot. And if we were to talk more about, what I do, this is something that I'd bring up too, is noticing in your system what actually soothes you. As much as we can, go outside, right? Take frequent breaks, frequent walks, and get involved with your own therapeutic process. And this has to do with parents. Parents know what's activating you and recognize that, because the more that a parent is dysregulated, the more the kid is dysregulated. We talk about dysregulated, we're talking about those moments where anxiety creeps in, we're yelling at the kids, we feel like just anxious, like kind of vibing inside of our system, and we don't know what to do anymore.
mm,
Um, we have to get familiar with those feelings in order to name them, to tame them. That's a bunch of neural activity that's happening when we start to feel that way. And if we're going through life unconscious to that's what's happening, we're going to become very reactive with our kids too. And so I am a huge fan of parents do your work. Get a therapist. Talk through what's happening for you, learn about activation. And the more you know about your system, the more you can down regulate your system and then co regulate with your kids.
mm,
But
yeah.
going outside is a huge part of that.
Mm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The uh, activation
Yes.
is our nervous systems firing up, to,
Mhm.
and then down regulating
Yeah.
is is uh, is calming down
Soothing it back
and
down.
soothing
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
uh, with uh, your clients.
Yeah.
Uh, w- what uh, what is lately?
Mhm.
Uh, what is something that you're 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 really enjoying or loving about your work?
Gosh, there are so many parts. When I work with my clients, I talk about building an organic relationship with them. Now, of course, that comes within the confines of boundaries, right? I'm not a friend. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a mentor. I'm a therapist. But that relationship that we're building is genuine within the walls of the work that we're doing together, within the walls of my office. Um, and I love working with my people because we start building that from the very first session. We start building that trust together and our relationship together. And so, one of the things that I love seeing with the people that I work with is their excitement and their courage in the midst of the fear of the work they're doing. What I
Mm,
mean by that is coming into my office space, they have to face the hard parts of their story, and that can be really scary. But we've created together over time, right? That stability, that slowness that we're walking into their story, that they look forward to coming into this space. And I look forward to seeing them because I genuinely have that idea of like this mother hen, right? Of wrapping my arms around their story while they're with me. And so I've just been appreciating working with clients that maybe started especially a year ago and being able to reflect with them on the growth that they're doing. That is one of my favorite things. In fact, I end most of my sessions by reflecting on their growth and like just noticing out loud for them, hey, look at how far you've come. Man, I know you're struggling with this thing and that's okay, but also what would this have looked like 10 months ago?
mm,
18 months ago. And so giving them that hope and that courage, and it's so exciting to watch them, like we talked about in my story, kind of come alive, wake up to who they can be and what they can accomplish in their own sense of self. I love that so much. So it's
yes.
what keeps bringing me back.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That, that's one of the reasons why I started the podcast
Uh-huh.
is uh, that that part
Mhm.
of working with people is
Yes.
so inspiring. Like I'm so proud of my clients
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah.
I like what you said, excitement and courage,
Mhm.
even when you're scared.
Mhm.
It's uh, to see people be brave. But like I can't share. I would just like want to brag on clients, but I
Right.
can't share their stories because
Right.
it's confidential. And
That's
so,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's um, but there's so much power in being able to share your story like you've done with the abuse recovery.
Yeah.
Uh, um, so w- what are your dreams for
Gosh. Yeah.
your writing or
Yeah.
speaking? Like, do you want to do more speaking?
I would love to. I love the idea of training. So I don't hold a lot of weight in this, but I'm an Enneagram 5, a 5 with a strong 6 wing. So data and knowledge are my jam. I love it. I feel like it's so empowering. So when I sit and practice with my clients, I always say there are no secrets in therapy. I will tell you everything I know. If I'm going to use a tool, I'll tell you what the tool is. I'll tell you how it's going to work, and then we'll reflect on how it actually helped you.
Hmm.
So there's power in knowledge. So I spend quite a bit of time in psychoeducation with my clients. And that you had asked before, how do you learn the language? And well, you learn the language by sitting with someone who knows that side of it, right? So I do this beautiful job of blending this neuroscience piece. I'm a total brain nerd. I love all the language of the brain and watching how the body responds. But then I blend it really well with this relational aspect. And I think that that's where we find the most growth and healing. So, that said, I would love to do this with more people. Since I was in graduate school, I've had this deep desire to train up the next generation of clinicians, and I'm working on that right now. I don't know
Hmm.
what that's going to look like, but I have dreams to go that way. My dear friend and colleague, Marnie, and I are moving our office in together. So we'll again still be separate, private practice, but we'll be working next to each other. And we've got a little office space in there. And our dream is to be able to bring in interns to be able to use that office space. Um, I love education. I love teaching. I think it's so empowering. I think it gives people what they need for their own recovery stories. And so, I mean, I don't know where this, I would love to be, the next Brene Brown. That's never going to happen. But if I could travel around and speak to churches or groups and tell them what I know alongside a colleague that can help train, I mean, there doesn't feel like there's anything better because I love the work that I do. I think it's really valuable, and I want to bring other clinicians into that as well.
Hmm.
It's a
That's
big thing.
awesome.
Yeah.
The I I am looking forward to seeing
Mm,
how you grow.
mm,
And um, it's been neat since we've met,
yeah.
well, since we first met, to
Mhm.
just see just your the work that you do,
Yeah.
um, the passion that you have, um, and it is good to learn more about why you're so passionate about
Mhm.
what you do.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and you're absolutely right. Like the work that you do, it's valuable, it's so needed.
Mhm.
um and yeah, thank you for coming on to
Yeah.
share a little bit more. I learned a lot today. um for listeners, if they want to learn more about you, uh, how can they connect with you?
Well, and this might be a place that I can ask for anyone who might be listening. I have a website that I would love to be revamped. So I'll give you the website with the caveat that says I don't love the way that it's presented right now, and I would love some help developing that a little bit more. But KimberlyDudleyCounseling.com is my website. Probably a little bit more around the teaching edge would be my blog, Redemptive Grace blog, is a place that I did a lot of the early work working through my story. But you can find me on any platform where you can find therapists. So, Psychology Today, Therapy Den, Portland Therapy Network, I'm on all of those as well. And that talks a little bit more in depth about what does it actually look like to come into my practice? What are we actually doing here? But other than that, I don't have a huge social media presence. I haven't worked into that part of it. I adore sitting with actual human beings. And so the social media isn't necessarily my jam. Um, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Uh, I'll put the links for
Okay.
those in the show notes and in the video. Um, any last thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm just so thankful that you had me on. I'm kind of thinking in my head like, did we talk about everything? There's so much more. Can we have more time? And I'm also just wondering, you like, did I answer your questions enough? But I am so grateful for the opportunity to just start sorting through some of this. And I'm hopeful for whoever might be listening that something will spark an interest and they'll ask more questions of you, of me, of what we've created here together. I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, Siobhan, to bring us together, these clinicians that can share their information and their resources. I just think it's a beautiful mind. So,
Thank you so much.
yeah.
Uh, hopefully have you back on to dig deeper into the things that you introduced today.
Yeah, we just kind of scratched the surface, didn't we?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank
Mhm.
you.
Yeah.
See you
Thank you.
next time.
Okay. Bye.